This is Brent with Lykins Motorsports, and I'm doing some preliminary checks on Mr. Norrie's intake manifold and thought this would be beneficial for you guys to see as well. If you're at home assembling your own engine or looking to change intake manifolds or whatever, there's pretty much a checklist that I go by mentally every time that I do this. It mostly revolves around gasket fitment and intake manifold geometry. So we're going to go over a few of those things right now. First thing we'll discuss is our intake gasket fitment. And I like these paper gaskets. Mr. Gasket makes a lot of those, and I choose to use those, especially for FEs, because they don't really compress much, and once you glue them down, they stay glued down. They also come with these nifty little inserts so that you can block off your heat riser. For us high performance guys, we don't want hot air getting into the intake manifold because that sucks horsepower. But we need to make sure first that the gaskets fit the ports, and sometimes to do that you have to cut these little tabs off, and I usually cut those completely off and glue the gaskets to the cylinder head anyway. So I'll probably do that now, and if you see what's going on here, this gasket kind of puts the roof of the gasket line below the roof of the port line. So once we get rid of that little tab right there, we can line him up and make him fit the port the way that he needs to. So we'll get that whacked off, and I'm not going to glue these down now. Obviously, we're just taking measurements and getting a game plan together, but what you can do is you can tape these to the cylinder head so that they don't move around, and then you can position your intake manifold down and see what's going on with it. So gasket positioning is the first step. The second step is that we will be putting the intake manifold on to see where the port alignment is. If you remember from the past video, the intake fit really well and without gaskets. So that pretty much tells me that I'll have to do some cutting. But what we're going to do is we're going to mock up our intake manifold, put a couple bolts in it, and we have our block with the head gaskets on, so the geometry will be correct. But we'll draw that intake manifold down, then we'll reuse our bore scope and see where we sit. If you have already done that part and everything fits well, I would suggest using something like this or a machinist straight edge or something like that. This is a BHJ fixture, and it's made specifically for Fords since they have their own angle, but you can lay this on here, and then you can make sure that there are no daylight in between, and then you can check it on the back and on the front. Obviously, since I know that we're going to be cutting this intake, I'm not really concerned about this because it'll be made correct if it's not correct when they mill the intake. If you're bolting on a new out-of-the-box aftermarket intake, please do yourself a favor and check it one way or the other. If you don't have a fixture, then sometimes you can lay the intake down on the heads without gaskets, and you can see if the angles are correct. You know, you don't want a big gap up here and then touch down here, or vice versa. So if it does that, then you will need to have that corrected. First and foremost, priority is to make sure your ports line up. This is coming from the race side of things. If your ports don't line up, you could potentially lose a lot of horsepower. If the top of your intake manifold sits way up here, for example, then the incoming air fuel charge is going to hit a wall, and it has to try to find a way to get into the port. So you want a seamless transition from the intake manifold to the cylinder head. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove my tabs off the gaskets. I'm going to tape these on, and then we're going to set our intake manifold down and check everything out. One thing I did forget to mention real quick is if you're working with FEs, you know, there's multiple cylinder head layouts. You have the low riser, medium riser, high riser, tonal port. Be very cautious on which gasket you use for the cylinder head that you have. If you're using a low riser head and a medium riser intake manifold, then there will be a significant port mismatch down here at the bottom, and there are gaskets made for that combination. So just take a few minutes and make sure everything is going to fit. The FE is really finicky about intake manifold fitment, and what compounds that is the fact that your intake gaskets are submerged. So if this were an FE engine, the intake manifold valve cover flange meets the cylinder head valve cover flange, and the intake gasket lays in between those. Obviously, oil is able to run down from the top, so if there's any discrepancy whatsoever in geometry, then you will be sucking oil into your intake ports. So just a word of advice there. So we got our gaskets taped on. As you can see, the sides fit really well. The height fits really well. And we're ready to set our intake manifold on. I got both sides on here. So when you do this, just be very ginger about setting the intake on, because you don't want to shift these gaskets out of the way. It will kind of impede your view of the port. So just be very cautious when you do that. Okay, so we got our intake on. I've got a bolt on each side to draw it down, and we've got a nice even gap across the front and the back. Here's what we're looking at. So this is the roof of the port. I've got my scope going down this number 4 intake port. This is what we're looking at, the side of the port, the roof of the port. So if I move everything over a little bit, you can see that there is a discrepancy in the port height versus the intake manifold, or versus the cylinder head. You can see it really good right there. So everything needs to be moved down. That's why we were talking about having to cut the intake flanges. So I can make a measurement of how much it needs to be cut, and then the flanges will be milled, and then we'll have a great port alignment once the intake is bolted down. So obviously we want just a seamless flow from the intake manifold to the cylinder head. Air fuel charge tends to hug the roof of the port. So if you have a mismatch at the floor, it's not really that critical. The sides and the roof is very critical. Okay, this is the number 1 intake port. We're kind of upside down. To the left of your screen, you will see the valve guide protruding, and you will see kind of a little bit of a bronze and probably the valve sticking out. Towards the right of your screen, you will see that we have, again, the roof mismatch, and this will be really easy for me to determine how much I need to cut, because our intake is sitting essentially right even with the gasket the way that it sits. So it'll be easy for me to just measure what's below the gasket there to the height of the head port, and determine on how much to make a cut. If you have a single plane intake, this is really easy, as you don't have to use you really don't have to use a scope. You can just eyeball it and make a determination. All right, so got the intake off and can see better the way that our gaskets lay against the head. How much I got to take off, and it's going to be around 50 thousandths of an inch. So that amount will be taken off both flanges and also both of the end rails, so that we have sufficient gap for some silicone in there, and so that when we draw the bolts down, it doesn't bottom out against the block. If it bottoms out against the block, then it will hold the intake up off of the heads, and then you get some nice leaks, which we don't want. All right, so just sneaking up on this build slowly but surely. I guess the information I gave you could be used for any engine, and I would suggest that you take some care when you bolt an intake on, just to make sure that all the geometry is correct. If not, then you can get vacuum leaks, you can get oil leaks, you can get coolant leaks, and you don't want any of that. So an extra hour of measuring and checking things out will save you a lot of hassle down the road. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching another video, and hope to offer some more videos in the future for you guys to watch, and hopefully learn some things to help you on your next engine build at your house. But I appreciate all of you guys, and hope you have a wonderful weekend.